how does the Bible tie together into one story?
Let's put that to the test.
This is Prove All Things, a podcast where we test everything so that we can hold fast to what is good and abstain from what is evil.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. I'm Jared McCrary. Larson Plyler, Lonnie Oldag, and Tad Quarter are here with me today. We're going to talk about the story of the Bible. If we were to just pick up the Bible and start reading it, especially if we're not very familiar with it, maybe even if we were a first-time reader, regardless of where we opened up the Bible and started reading, we'd probably be lost. So how do we learn to make sense out of what the Bible says? What if we had a friend that knew nothing about the Bible, but we wanted to explain to them the story of the Bible? Could we give some kind of map, or could we give some kind of guidance as to how to understand the Bible, how it's a continuous story, and how that story fits together? And so that's really our purpose in this podcast. How could we show someone the story of the Bible, maybe in somewhat of a concise way?
Yeah, and I think when we open up the Bible, we do get a lot of information very early on in the first few chapters of the book of Genesis. We see this incredibly powerful and wise being who creates all things. And it tells us how we fit into the story there a little bit as well, because it tells us that we were created in his image, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, 27. And so he made us in his image, and I think that implies, as we continue on through the story, that implies something about our relationship with him. He made us in his image to have a relationship with him, to have fellowship with him. And yet, it doesn't take very long into the story at all. By chapter 3, we see the major problem, and that is the problem of man's disobedience. Man doesn't trust God. Man rebels against God's instruction. And so now there's this separation between man and God, who were supposed to be in fellowship and supposed to have a relationship in there. So here's the major problem that we're facing in the Scripture.
Yeah, and so in Genesis chapter 3, you have the first sin, and then all the consequences that flow from that, because God entrusted his creation to these stewards, to man and woman, to oversee and to manage this creation. But then they took that responsibility and kind of handed it over to Satan by listening to the serpent in the garden. And so what we see in the brokenness of our world is the result of now Satan being in charge of the good world that God created in some ways. And yet, in the middle of talking about the consequences that were going to come, God made a promise to the man and to the woman by cursing that serpent. He said that one day the seed of woman would come and would crush the head of the serpent, but the serpent would bruise that seed of woman's heel. And so the promise is that one day God would send somebody to crush the head of the serpent, that he would crush evil right at its source. But in the process, the one who would crush the serpent would be bruised. Now, that's a vague promise. We don't know a lot about what that's going to look like. But from Genesis 3:15 on, we're looking for the serpent crusher, right? We're looking for the one who's going to come and who's going to solve this problem that's been created by the serpent, who's going to crush evil right at its source.
Yeah, and I think one thing before we move on any further, when we're talking about this story unfolding, it's very evident that when God did create us, he created us in his image, and maybe that means several different things, but I think it's also important to note that God did create man with free will. That's why there has to be a redemptive plan. God did not create us here and then force us beyond our will to serve him in any way, yet God gave free will. The fact that he gave a choice to us, I think, needs to be pointed out, and that's what makes this plan of God so necessary. God knew without a doubt, if I give men free will, inevitably they'll rebel. Inevitably they'll go against me. Well, that unfolds within the first couple of chapters of the Bible. They had one rule, and they broke that, and so that's what started this process.
Yeah, and let me just say that, if we ended right there, this is a tragedy. I mean, this all is lost at this point. And so the fact that all takes place in the first 3 chapters, it looks really dark, but the rest of the Scripture is a solution to this problem.
Right.
Yeah, and it's not that humanity figures it out and gets better. I mean, for the next several chapters, we see that humanity just descends into chaos. And so we end up with God destroying the whole world except for one family because of their sin and because of their violence. And then humanity begins to build up again, and you say, okay, well, maybe this time they'll have it figured out, and that's not at all the case either. Genesis 11, we read about the Tower of Babel. Again, humanity as a whole is in rebellion towards God. And so we get to the end of chapter 11, and the history of humanity up until about 2000 BC, we would guess. You look at that, and you have just the question that we're left with is, what is God going to do with this, right? These people keep rebelling. They keep turning away from him. How is God going to solve this problem? When's the snake crusher coming, right? We're looking for all of those, the answers to all those questions.
And that becomes the significance of Abraham and his place in the story. The world has been populated again, but the promise in Genesis 3:15 was clearly a promise about an individual. So you're looking at a world with, there's no telling how many millions of people in it. And then you have God coming to Abraham and identifying him as one who's going to be used to bless the world. And we talked about the vagueness of Genesis 3:15. I think probably the promises here are a little vague in Genesis 12, but they get more specific as Abraham's life continues to unfold. And maybe specifically we will look at verses 2 and 3 in Genesis chapter 12. God comes to Abraham and tells him to leave his country, leave his father's house, to go to a land that I will show you. And he says in verse 2, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And, again, that's a little vague, but he does say, in addition to the idea of the nation promise, he says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Later he says, in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice, in Genesis 22 and verse 18. And, the significance of that, at least, that would be a little bit of a fast forward, but Paul in Galatians 3 verse 16 specifically connects this promise to the coming of Jesus Christ. He connects it to an individual. That's how all the families of the earth would be blessed. And that was kind of the premise of our podcast. How does Jesus kind of connect with the rest of the Bible? How does the Bible connect it?
So the solution to this problem is now narrowing down to the family of Abraham.
Yeah.
Right, but what would you take it to mean when he says that I will make you a great nation? Well, what exactly does that mean when he makes that promise to Abraham?
Yeah, well, what he's going to do is he's going to develop this family into something that he's going to use for a number of different reasons, and one of those reasons is to bring about that seed, that promise, that snake crusher.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so through the rest of Genesis, we have the promise continuing down through Abraham's son Isaac. There's a lot of details that we can't go into. Isaac, and then Isaac's sons Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons. And so we might wonder, okay, who's the promise going to come through? Well, in one way, the promise is going to come through all 12, right? They are going to be the patriarchs of this great nation that's going to be built. Their descendants, of course, are going to be the ones that inherit the land. But there's one son in particular, Genesis 49, verse 10. Jacob, on his deathbed, is making promises and prophecies about his sons. And he talks to his son Judah. And he says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of all the peoples. And so Jacob is looking into the future and sees that a kingly line is going to come from Judah, that there's going to be a line of kings, and then finally there's going to be one that the obedience of all the peoples, the nations, will belong to. And so now we've narrowed it down even further. So now we're looking to the tribe of Judah, and maybe we don't get a lot more details for a while about who this is going to come from, but what we do have is the development of this nation. And by the end of at the opening of the book of Exodus, they're in slavery in Egypt, and so maybe that presents somewhat of a problem as we're reading through.
Yeah, but that slavery also presents the stage in which God is going to be able to show who he is, both to them and to the world in that. And so you have the stories that are pretty well known by a lot of people about God using Moses to send the plagues upon the Egyptians and lead Israel out of Egypt and through the Red Sea. And what God is doing is he's bringing these people, Abraham's descendants, out to make them a great nation.
So the story of the Bible really from Genesis 12 just follows this nation that God has promised He's going to build this nation up, and it is through this nation that eventually all families of the earth will be blessed. So that's kind of the way the story unfolds.
Yeah, and at least two of those promises in Genesis specify an individual. He shall bruise the serpent's head. To him shall be the obedience of the peoples. It wasn't just a class of rulers coming from Judah that was being talked about. It was a single ruler whose reign would be characterized by Shiloh, or peace, which is what Shiloh means.
So when we get to Exodus, we see God taking this group of people and He gives them a special law. And that law was going to make them distinct from all the other nations. And so a lot of what we see in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, we see this law being given. We see the specifics of this law. And that's confusing to a lot of people. But God's giving this law to teach lessons to this nation, the children of Israel, Abraham's descendants, but also through them learning those lessons, it's recorded, and we learn lessons from those laws as well.
Yeah, and when they come into the land, God fulfills that land promise. In just after Moses dies, the children of Israel go into the land. Joshua leads them. But I think what we see after that first generation of people who go into the land, Israel really doesn't fulfill its purpose of being this nation that God was supposed to be king over. Right? They were supposed to be distinct from the nations. They were going to be holy to God. And that's not what we see. I think the last verse of the book of Judges kind of gives us a good summary. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And that's really kind of the story, not only in the book of Judges, but throughout the history of the people of Israel. Now, there are bright spots, and we might talk about some of those. But for the most part, what we see is in Israel, they just want to be like the rest of the nations. And that creates, maybe we would look at that and say, well, doesn't this create a problem for God's purposes? If these people are going to be evil and wicked, how is He going to bless all nations through them? But God is making promises all along there still, even in spite of His people's faithlessness.
Yeah, let me make just one point about some of the things that we learn from the law that God has given, and we learn it through the period of the Judges as well. God is a holy God, and He's not able to tolerate sin. And that's the problem, because we have people that are in sin, and yet God cannot tolerate that. But we also see that God is a very merciful God, and He continues to, rather than just wipe them out or give up on them, He continues to try to bring them back to Himself. He continues to try to offer some reconciliation in some way. So we learn something about the nature of God through these laws and through His dealings with this pretty rebellious people.
Yeah, and I think maybe we didn't make this point in the very beginning, and we don't have time to really allow this thought to unfold, but maybe just briefly mention, why are we here to start with? Well, all we can infer is what God has kind of shown us, and that God's ultimate desire is to have a relationship with us. And what sin does when we make those wrong choices, when we rebel against God, as Lonnie just mentioned, we have separated ourselves from God. So now here's the story unfolding. What is God going to do? Again, if God created us with free will, inevitably it was the fact that we were going to separate ourselves. God is a holy God. So how can we be brought back to holiness so that we can be in that relationship? And that's where you see the love of God, the patience of God, the mercy of God poured out continually through this whole story, which goes back to God's desire to have a relationship with us.
Hundreds of years are passing as we're going through and summarizing this,
Right.
And it's fascinating to me to think about how God does not forget His promises. And so that promise in Genesis 3:15, that snake crusher, the promise to Abraham, the promise to Judah, God hasn't forgot all of that. And by the time we get to like 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, we see God begin to narrow down again to choose an individual from Abraham's seed, from Judah, that He's going to bring about some more promises.
Yeah, in 2 Samuel 7, he talks to David, who might be one of the most famous characters of the Old Testament. Again, we know lots of the individual stories associated with David, right? Whether it's him killing Goliath or the story of David and Bathsheba. But David fits into this larger storyline because in 2 Samuel 7, God promises that He's going to establish David's kingdom forever. And some of those promises have to do with the descendants of the immediate descendants of David, right? Establishing the kingdom in Judah. But then there's some language there that just it can't apply to just a normal, ordinary kingdom, right? He talks about establishing a kingdom forever, verse 13. And one thing we know about the kingdoms of men, they're not forever. They last for a while and then they're gone. And so God is making a promise that he's going to do something special with a descendant of David. And throughout the rest of the Old Testament, the prophets, the Psalms, many of them are looking forward to the fulfillment of this promise of the descendant of David that's going to finally reign on God's throne in truth, in justice, in righteousness, who's going to bring peace that was promised to Judah. Who's that going to be? What's that going to look like? And so we're looking for that all the way through the prophets.
Yeah, something. Let me just say this. Something that's really interesting about this time period. God uses David to record a lot of information about his thoughts and his feelings and so forth, and he records things that are going to be about the Messiah. And so we get little details, little hints that we wouldn't probably pick up on at this point, but later we'll see the significance, such as David talking about his hands and his feet being pierced, and them casting lots for his garments in one of the Psalms. And yet that's going to come back later, and we're going to recognize somebody by those particular marks. And so it's interesting how God is revealing this and letting this play out.
Well, all I was going to do is connect some language from the story of David to the story of Jesus. I'm going to read here from Psalm 89, verses 35 and 36. Once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. And so implied in that is a promise to David. But then you see the seed again. Seed of woman, Genesis 3. Seed of Abraham, Genesis 12. And now seed of David. And when Jesus came into the world, one of the things that Gabriel said to Mary was, I will give him the throne of his father David. And so that, again, is going to connect David to the coming of Christ.
Yeah, as we close the Old Testament, you've got a world in ruins because of sin. Israel is home from captivity, but they're a shell of their former selves, right? They're really just kind of a puppet state of other empires in the world. The throne of David looks to be unoccupied, right? And so I think at the end of Psalm 89, it talks about the Davidic kingdom being cast into the dust. Well, we close the Old Testament, and the curtain draws, and it's a pretty dark scene. And then, as you may mention, that promise of Gabriel to say, I'm going to give him the throne of his father David, it's as if God hadn't forgotten about his promise. And he just kind of picks up right where he left off 400 years before. And here we're going to fulfill all those promises. God is going to fulfill all those promises in Jesus.
And maybe through all of this, we see a lesson that is constantly taught to us in the Bible. Larson, I think you mentioned this earlier about how perhaps it raises a question. All these people are being disobedient. How is that going to affect God and his purposes and his promises? Well, it doesn't. Because what God is able to do is punish those who are disobedient to him, while at the same time making the provisions necessary to bless those who would put their faith in him and put their trust in him. And so Israel's being punished. Their kingdom is in ruins, and at the same time, he's going to keep all his promises to Abraham, to David, even to Eve, if we want to think back that far. He's going to set up the Christ to sit on his throne, and he's going to bless all the nations of the earth through him, through those who put their trust in Jesus Christ.
Amen.
So by the time we finish the Old Testament, what we have is we know what the problem is, we know what the promises are, and God has led us through a lot of lessons of understanding his character and our relationship to him, but those promises have not yet been fulfilled. And so we're waiting that, we're anticipating that. So when we get to the end of the Old Testament, we're wondering, when's that snake crusher going to come? We've got some identifying marks now. We're looking for him and we're waiting for him. But it ends right there, and we'll have to wait to see in the New Testament.
All right. Yeah, so we're going to make everybody else wait to hear the rest of the story because we've exhausted all of our time here. But that does kind of cover the Old Testament, and hopefully that's a good summary of it, that as Lonnie just mentioned, there's a problem. Here's the solution. It's God's solution, and he is going to make promises that are seemingly vague, and this is all going to unfold through lots of people and over hundreds of years of time, but we can follow one continuous story, and it is a story of a Savior, and God allows us to follow that all throughout history. So thank you for listening to this podcast. We'll follow it up with continuing the story of the Bible, and we'll talk more about the New Testament and how all that we've talked about today in the Old is fulfilled in the New. So stay tuned for that. If perhaps you have something that you would like to hear a discussion about, we invite you to reach out to us and let us know what you'd like to hear. You can find us on Facebook, or you can reach us via email, proveallthings@mail.com. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Prove All Things. To suggest a topic, raise a question, or offer a comment, write to proveallthings@mail.com.
All right.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I was not looking. Did I get a point?
No.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No, you said yeah, but then you were still typing.
Oh, I'm ready.
Okay.
I'm ready. I just thought I must have missed the point or something.
No.
You want to put those headphones on?
Man, I'm just go sit in the car.
Good night. Look at that.
Oh no.
How long was it?
1955. I forgot to, I hit, when you said proveallthings@mail.com, you took a breath and I hit stop, so I didn't get the thank you for listening.
Oh.
Let's do it over.
The whole thing?
Yeah.
Could we do it a little shorter?
Yeah.
Let's do it shorter. We'll get more New Testament in.